Most Christians are told that the Bible teaches that we're supposed to tithe to our churches. But what if I told you that the Bible actually never once teaches Christians to do this at all? What if giving 10% just to check a box that doesn't even exist isn't just unbiblical, but is totally unfaithful to what God actually commands us to do in scriptures? I'm a pastor with a master's in theology and who's in the middle of a doctorate program. And what I want to share today is what I learned this semester in one of my classes that, after hours of research, absolutely flipped my giving on its head. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to share with you the 3 guidelines to giving that I've written down for myself that actually comes from what the Bible teaches about giving. Now, all this began when I started asking the simple question, where does tithing come from? Now, most of us know that yaser, which is just the Hebrew word for the word tithe, means a tenth or giving 10%. And to this extent, we could say that I've given a tenth or a tithe to my retirement account when we give 10% and put it into a 401k. But the idea of tithing or giving a tenth to some group of people in obedience to God comes from the Mosaic Law. Specifically, this comes from Leviticus chapter 27, where the Lord commands that a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. But even before the Mosaic Law, we actually see 2 accounts of people giving a tithe or a tenth of what they own to the Lord. Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek and Jacob gave 10% of what he owned to Bethel. But since these 2 instances are just describing what happened rather than giving a principle or an application that you and I are supposed to follow, we can pretty much set these to the side. In truth, everything that we've been told about the tithe comes from Leviticus chapter 27. The New Testament does talk about tithing, but only in reference to the Old Testament law. This is why I think it's so important for us to say that there is not a single commandment in the entire Bible that commands Christians to tithe. Because remember, Christians wasn't a term for believers until Acts chapter 2. But here's the part that nobody ever talks about. And that's that the Old Testament believers weren't commanded to give just 10%. No, they were commanded to give somewhere closer to 23.3% of their income. 10% was given to the Levitical priestly tithe, which is what we've already talked about. 10% was given to what was called the festival tithe, which was the funds that they would use to put on worship, communal worship sessions. And then finally, the third tithe was called the charity tithe, and it was given to the widows and the fatherless and foreigners who had come into the land. This totals to almost a quarter of what these people made annually. The thought of us giving a quarter of our income to anything, even our own retirement, seems impossible for most people. Yet these Old Testament believers, under the Mosaic Law, would consistently and faithfully give 23.3% of their income to the Lord. So here's the question. What about us? It seems that every other pastor that I interact with has a different answer to this question. In fact, if you comment below what your pastor teaches you about tithing, we're going to see this vast array of different opinions on the subject. And while every pastor might have their own personal conviction on the matter, what you and I are actually interested in is, what does the Bible teach? In order to find this out, we need to go to the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, after the death of Christ, you and I are given an entirely different list of commandments when it comes to the tithe that completely blows 23.3% out of the water. And this is where we find the radical truth that nowhere following the death of Christ, where believers were first called Christians, do we ever see a commandment to tithe to our churches. Instead, we see one simple command, and that is to give. And the 2 ways that we're commanded to give is generously and cheerfully. And by me simply calling this out, I know I'm going to offend so many different Christian leaders. Because the reality is that with our history of the way that we teach the Bible, we don't always give the full picture in the church. In fact, the leaders of the Puritan churches in America taught their congregants to tithe by renting pews, meaning that the richer you are and the more that you tithe to the church, the closer your pew was to the pastor and the stage. Because of this, the poorer folk would either sit in the very back row or would even have to sit on the margins of the church because they weren't able to give as much. Now, the commands to give generously and cheerfully are found all throughout the New Testament, but I personally think they're really beautifully put in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, where we're taught that the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows generously will also reap generously. In other words, when you give generously, God will bless us generously. But he says this, each one must do just as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So whether leaders are telling us to rent pews like they did in the Puritan culture, or give 10% in obedience to a law that doesn't even apply to us anymore. Your giving cannot be reluctant or under compulsion. And when it is, it's unfaithful and unbiblical. There are actually two different ways that the New Testament teaches us to give. But before I share those with you, if you're enjoying this content, it would mean the world for you to like and subscribe so that I can keep creating videos just like this. The first way that we're commanded to give is to the church. And there are just tons of verses that talk about this, but I'll just hone in on 1 Timothy chapter 5, where it teaches us that we should pay our pastors because a laborer is worthy of his wages. And the reality is, as long as you're attending a healthy church, that is, your giving in this way isn't just giving to the church, it's also giving through the church. As your church engages in the biblical mission, as they use their funds to support the local mission and the global mission of the church. The second way that we're commanded to give is charitably, and this could be to friends or family or those in need in your local area. And once again, there are tons of verses that talk about this, but I want to emphasize 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, where it says that if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. So as we go about budgeting our giving, it's important for us to determine in our heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, how much we'd like to give to our local church. But it's also important that we seek out ways to bless those that are around us. Now let's get to the 3 guidelines of giving that I've written down for me and my wife that we've implemented in our own budget. The first guideline is to focus on the heart, not the calculator. The reality is that God's grace doesn't demand less generosity, it demands a change in heart. And if you're anything like me, I'm a planner. And I've decided in my heart what I would like to give to the local church and to the parachurch ministry organizations that I support. And when somebody else, a friend or a family member, comes up to me asking me for money, my initial reaction is, whoa man, you're not on the budget. But in the same way that the widow from Mark chapter 12 gave not 10% but 100%, and in the same way that Jesus commanded the rich young ruler not to give 10% of his wealth but 100% of his wealth, when you and I give generously and cheerfully, it's a matter of our hearts, not our calculators. The second guideline to giving is to judge no one. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul is confronting Christians who are judging one another based on how well they continue to upkeep the Old Testament law. And Paul's charge is simple: let no one judge. It is so easy for us to judge those who are giving less than us, or to even judge those who are giving more from us out of fear that they're going to judge us first. The bottom line is that it's a matter of the heart, that each person, if we were to follow the biblical command, is going to give whatever they decide in their own heart to give. That could be well below 10% for some people. That could be well above 10% for other people. But we are each called to stay in our lane and to be faithful to what God has called us to do. The third guideline to giving is to not treat it like a checked box. This is why giving 10% so quickly becomes not only unbiblical, but also unfaithful. But God is interested in our hearts, not in creating some habit where we give a certain percentage of our income that allows us to feel this Christian elitism. And this isn't the only unbiblical habit that I see in the church. In fact, there are 5 unbiblical habits that Christians have that are keeping them poor, and I talk about them in this video right here. Click and I'll see you there.